everyone. Thank you for your patience. And welcome to our first in-person book talk in almost 3 years. Thank you for being here, and again, thank you for your patience. My name is Ryan Crochet, and I'm the Communications and Administration Coordinator at Gutman Library. I would like to begin by briefly introducing Sarah Peterson, Professor of Education here at HGSE, and also founder and director of REACH, an initiative that fosters welcoming communities and quality education in settings of migration and displacement. Sarah, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, ma'am. This is great, and it's just really wonderful to see everybody and be back in this space. As someone who grew up loving libraries, I have never stopped loving libraries, and I think libraries are meant to be lived in and books are meant to be talked about. So this is a wonderful space to do that. And also to welcome back Jessica Lander and this beautiful, sunny community space here. And I think that this is a really important welcome back for almost a decade now, and probably even more. Jessica has been a key part of the fabric of HGSE. When we first met, it was one of the very first years that I was teaching. And since then, you, Jessica, have been many things all at once. Teacher, writer, community builder. And one of the things that I have learned from watching you, Jessica, at work is that you see these identities and live these identities as so intertwined, one leading into and building from the other, into this kind of concentric and interweaving circles. Today, we're gathering to both witness and discuss some of this weaving that you have done, bringing together your experience as a classroom teacher and deep listener and learner with your students, and your research, both historical and contemporary, in classrooms and schools, in your new book, which I see around, and there are copies for sale over there, Making American, Stories of Historic Struggles, New Ideas, and Inspirations in Immigrant Education. To this book, you bring your history and civics teaching with recent immigrant students at Lowell High School, work that has been recognized, and you're being named a top 50 finalist for the Global Teacher Prize in 2021, and a Massachusetts Teacher of the Year finalist in 2022. I am delighted to be in conversation together, both about the processes of learning from students and about what you learned in the course of researching and writing this book. So Jessica and I have planned out a kind of back and forth that includes some reading, some discussion, and we'll have time for discussion with the whole group at the end. So let's just welcome back Jessica Lander. Up to you.
First off, thank you all for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. Gutman Library holds a special place. Libraries in particular are just a place that I have always treasured, but Gutman, the purple couches, I have spent so much time on those purple couches doing study sessions, problem sets, and when I was here, that's been a while, it's terrifying, this was my home base. Right here in this library, in this first floor, with all of the folks, and so seeing so many people that I knew coming in. So it is exciting, and it is an honor to be here back in the space, and a huge honor to be here with you, Sarah. So I took, and we will talk about this, but I took 2 of Sarah's classes when I was a student here, both in the spring semester. She got just like a lot of me in all of her classes. But Sarah, it was in your classes where I really first started thinking about immigrant education, refugee education, thinking about how we center student stories in the work we did around storytelling, listening to young people and sharing those stories creatively, thinking about the interweaving of international policies, transnational policies, domestic policies, and how they impacted students. And I mean, my year at HGSE was transformative in the work that I do, but I particularly think their class and thinking about what my next steps were. I knew when I came into HGSE, I wanted to spend maybe 1 year, that's sort of really what I said in the classroom, and then I was going to go into policy, but I didn't know where and I didn't know what specifically. And it was from the learning we did in your class in particular that I think really led me to Lowell. Of course, that's now been 8 years since being at Lowell. That was that 1 year. So I am excited to talk about your class, but I remember also about what you're learning with your current students. But it is a huge honor to be in conversation with you, so thank you.
I was actually looking back at one of the first emails that you sent me at the end of this year here, and the line was something like, I meant to write it down. It looks like I might be teaching in a school with a large number of immigrant and refugee students next year. Maybe we could meet to talk about what that might be like. And you've found yourself in this space, and you led yourself to this space. And 8 years later, I guess it results in this book. Can you tell us more about what led to the book, how you decided that you were going to take your experiences and put one of those to share with others?
Absolutely. I teach, as Sarah said, I teach in Lowell at Lowell High School. It's actually the first integrated high school in the country, integrated at conception in the 1830s. And today it is, apparently my email to you, it is a community rich with immigrants from around the world. So I teach immigrants and refugees, recent immigrant and refugee students, teaching history and civics, mostly seniors, juniors, sophomores. And my students come from all over, from 30 different countries, from Colombia to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Cambodia. And I, for years coming out of HGSE, taking what I learned here in my classes and thinking about how to think about project-based learning projects in my class, how to create opportunities for our students to be teachers in our community. I think Pasi Salberg taught us to write op-eds when I was here, and I immediately took that assignment and converted it to a high school assignment, so my students every year publish op-eds in the Lowell Sun. So many different projects and ways that students then were both leading in the classroom and then leading in the community. And it was from working with them and learning with them that I both realized I wanted to be a better teacher of immigrant and refugee students. And so how do I learn from others? And then also, how can we do a stronger job of supporting and nurturing our immigrant-oriented students? Thinking about all the ways that they are creating homes and lives here. How do our schools nurture a strong sense of belonging? Which I know is something that both my book and your book talk a lot about. It's something that we think about a lot, and we're going to get into talking about belonging. And so from those two desires of wanting to be a better practitioner and wanting to think about the policy angles, because a lot of the work I did here when I was at HGSE is education policy and management, which doesn't exist, I think, anymore as a program, but it's sort of been lumped in. I was thinking about both the practice and the policy, and thinking about the connections between the two. And so I set off from the classroom for a year. I had a Emerson Collective Fellowship, and I got to travel around the country, visiting schools, sitting in the classrooms of others, learning about innovative creative experiments that were going on from a single classroom in North Dakota to an entire school district of 126 schools in North Carolina. And realizing too that in addition to those present innovations, I also would need to dive into the past, looking at the policies, the Supreme Court cases, the laws, the movements over the last 150 years that have transformed immigrant education today. And again, very much drawing on the classes I took here to think about the history of education policy in this country. And then finally, in addition to these stories of the past and these stories of the present, the heart of the work for me, and we talked a lot this week about that, is the stories of the personal, the stories of young people themselves, and sitting down with 7 of my remarkable young people who I had taught over the years and learning from them about their stories, about their experiences in our schools. Because if we're serious about reimagining our education, we need to be centering their stories, their experiences, and listening and learning from them to be be able to think about how we create schools that better nurture kids. So that was the impetus for writing the book, was traveling for a year, sitting in the classrooms of others, diving into this history, sitting with my students, and then came back to the classroom, but it was the virtual classroom, because it was in the midst of the pandemic, and have been now teaching full-time while also finishing writing, researching, and editing this book. It came out in October. Would love to dive into the stories, but that's really the inspiration. It really comes back to my students.
And I was going to invite you to read a section from the book. I think it's so powerful to hear those words right at the end.
That would be great. I was thinking of starting, Sarah, with the opening. To talk a little bit about my classroom and to invite you all into my classroom. And of course, I make a general invitation. If you would like to come actually physically visit my classroom, please reach out and let me know. I'm in Lowell, it's 30 minutes away, it's not that far, and you're more than welcome to come in the classroom this spring. But the book starts in the following way. Can I eat with you? It was September 2015, and one of my students hovered hesitantly at the classroom's door. Gangly and shy, Wilson was apologetic. He had recently left his home in Puerto Rico, coming to live and study 1,700 miles north of Lowell, Massachusetts. Now, surrounded by nearly 3,400 new peers, he felt lost. Though as a Puerto Rican, he was an American citizen by birth, he still often felt as foreign as the many immigrant peers who filled his new classes. Nowhere did he feel he belonged. I too was new to the community, having recently come to Lowell High School to teach immigrant and refugee teenagers. That first month, a routine was born. Each day after my 5th class, as students streamed out, Wilson would shuffle in, carrying pizza, a sandwich, or sometimes a baked potato smothered in sour cream. My desk became our makeshift lunch table. Little by little, I grew to know Wilson. I asked about his favorite classes, his weekend excursions, what he missed most about the island. Then one Friday, during lunch, he had a question for me. Pointing at my hands, he asked, "How did you learn to use those?" Nestled between my fingers were bamboo chopsticks. Wilson, I quickly learned, was mesmerized by all things Japanese. It was a love rooted in anime, which had spurred him to spend late nights reading Japanese history and practicing the katakana and hiragana alphabets. Over lunch, in a pause between classes, lesson planning, and grading, Wilson and I began speaking about learning languages and cultures. But our lunches did not remain one-on-one for long. Early in October, Wilson's classmate Nee, a tall, serious Vietnamese girl, asked to join. Nee was quickly followed by Po, an inquisitive Korean refugee from Southeast Asia. More soon followed. By November, lunch in my classroom was bustling with students. Yemeni, Iraqi, and Lebanese girls drew center seats into a circle. A Liberian boy who loved history hung with a freckled Tanzanian boy near the door. In seats along the wall, a gaggle of Brazilian girls liked to linger. 2 Cambodian girls sat side by side in front row desks. Students chatted, ate, hunched over unfinished homework, and peppered me with questions about history we had learned in class. Lunchtime also offered a master class in cuisines. Po presented classmates with excruciatingly spicy tiny fish. Nee unpacked Vietnamese soups and passed around her spoon. One Lebanese student brought in flaky diamonds baklava that left everyone licking honey from their fingertips. I watched as students, tentative, curious, enthusiastic, taste seaweed, egg curries, empanadas for the first time. I watched too as Wilson grew less reserved and more talkative, surrounded by his classmates from around the world. Almost everyone in the United States traces their origins elsewhere, to ancestors who, whether by force or by choice, built new homes and new lives here. Some arrived 400 years ago, and some 4 months ago. Some came seeking opportunities for themselves and for their children. Some came fleeing persecution. Many were brutally enslaved and forcibly transported across the Atlantic from the coast of West Africa. Even indigenous peoples, whose forebears have lived in America for millennia, were violently displaced from their ancestral homes. The result is a country of unrivaled diversity. America's plurality has always been a source of strength, and for many, a point of pride. Our coins proclaim E pluribus unum, a motto that originally referred to the union of 13 colonies, but now speaks of the union of peoples drawn from a multitude of countries and cultures. The plaque beneath the Colossus in New York Harbor has, for more than a century, promised welcome to the globe's tired, poor, and huddled masses. And yet, that same America has long fought to turn people away from its shores, especially based on where they come from, what religion they practice, or whom they love. Claiming that new arrivals would take jobs from Americans already here, or asserting that newcomers were racially inferior, the United States has excluded them from schools and from jobs. Suspicious of their customs and skeptical of their allegiance, states have passed laws banning them from speaking languages other than English, and people have pressured them to abandon their culture and religious heritages. Despite the tension between welcome and exclusion, the country has always relied and will continue to rely on new arrivals. They enrich America in hundreds of ways. They bring their talent, determination, and resilience to our shores. Given the importance of newcomers to this country, a critical question for our future is, how do we ensure that immigrants feel safe, supported, and valued, with the chances to put down roots and build new futures, so that they can become full participants in their new home? In short, what does it take to make Americans?
Thanks so much, Jessica. I think there's such power in reading and hearing these words as you framed the beginning of this book and really framed this question for all of us. What does it take to make Americans? And one of the core ideas that I see in your book that I think is so powerful is that this idea of making is an action, and it requires multiple people, it requires a collective endeavor to really think about what that process looks like. And I think, as you mentioned before, one of the things that I think both of us have learned from our students is that core to that is this idea of belonging. How do we really not just think of belonging as an abstract idea, but make belonging? Both you and I have final chapters in our books that are called Belonging, really coming to this kind of core idea. And one of the things that you do is you outline 8 elements that you see across your research, both with the past and the present, but also with the personal, that really can contribute to belonging not as an abstract concept, but as a process that teachers and students can engage in. And I wondered if you could tell us about these 8 elements. I know a lot of us are interested in engaging with that and really thinking about what we can do.
Absolutely, and I mean, I really smiled, Sarah, when I read your book this summer, and if you have not read Sarah's book, please go out and get it now. And seeing the centrality of belonging, because it so resonated with me, because it was like, I've been thinking about belonging for the last 3 years. And it really is a process. It is I mean, each student is the rightful owner of their identities, and shaping that is, but it is also informed by and shaped by all of those around them. And so thinking about the ways that schools, particularly schools, we're here in the med school, also policies, we're here in a school where many folks are involved in engagement, or will be involved in engagement with policies, can be thinking about the ways we can be intentionally nurturing belonging. But belonging can also be somewhat nebulous. If, like, what does it mean? How do schools do that? How do policies help nurture a sense of belonging? And so from those stories of the past, the stories of the present, the stories of the personal, the folks that I talked with across the country, pulling out these 8 elements of belonging, what they taught me, and I'll just read them to you. They're in the book. We can explore them. We can talk about them if you want. But for me, what I learned from others, the 8 elements that I found were: 1, opportunities for new beginnings; 2, supportive communities; 3, assurances of security; 4, chances to dream; 5, committed advocates. 6, recognition of students' strengths and assets. 7, acceptance for who students are and all their many beautiful identities. And 8, opportunities for students to develop their voice, and for us as schools and communities valuing those voices. And for me, those are the 8 elements that help someone feel a sense of belonging, particularly for our immigrant American students who are creating actively right now, creating new homes and new lives here. And what I've then been doing is trying to explore these 8 elements through the lens of the past, the present, the personal, and then think about what are the policies, what are the practices, what are the things we're doing in our classrooms and in our communities and in the legislature that can help address, can help nurture these 8 elements of law.
I mean, one of the things that the class that I was talking about before that Jessica took, we did the first version of what some of you did this past year, the narrative project, which was doing education and uncertainty. It was then education armed conflict, but really trying to think about this intertwining of policy, programs, practices, and people. And as I read across your 8 elements in your book and just listening to them now, that each one of these 8 elements requires that we think of all of those levels at the same time. So that to create supportive communities is not just about people, it has to be about the policies that enable them. To assure security can't just be about a program, but also needs to be about the people who one surrounds oneself with. Recognition of students' strengths requires not just the student to act in a certain way, but another to actually engage in that act of recognizing. And this mutual interaction. And yet, I think what we often see as, and you point to in your book, is that there are often real tensions in this. So what does it mean to create opportunities for new beginnings if those opportunities seem like they're coming up against someone else's opportunities? And so what you do in the book, which I think is so illuminating, is to look at some examples from the past, to see where we've come from in this, to try to think towards the future. And I wondered if you could share some of these past examples of policies that you see as being core to having been the stepping stones for immigrant education.
Absolutely. And then I'm going to also, because this is a conversation, we're going to go outside the U.S. and ask and think about international policies and transnational policies as well. And I'll shout out to my professors here for getting me to really dive into thinking about policies. I know that the lens I use, the way I try to understand and tackle thinking about these policies is very much informed about the learning that happened here, downstairs, upstairs, across the street. So the policy, I dove into 8 stories, 8 laws, Supreme Court cases, and movements that have transformed our schools, transformed our communities, many of which I did not know, that I was not necessarily taught in school, that are not usually taught in school, but I think are essential. So I'll tell you the stories of just 3 very briefly. But I think for me, what I found really powerful in having these stories first come to life for me and then try to bring them to life in the book is that these are stories of people. These are stories of courageous individuals. And there are the policies and the laws and the court cases that we can dive into and are meaty and fascinating and I talk about. But at the heart of it, these are the stories of people. So the first person I wanted to talk about is Robert Meyer, who was a parochial teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Nebraska in the 1920s. And in 1920, on a May afternoon, he is teaching his class. Particularly, he's asking one little boy to read, 11-year-old Raymond Carhart, to read the Bible in German during recess. And for doing this, he is arrested. Because at the time in Nebraska in 1920, it was illegal to teach German. Indeed, in about half the states in the country, it was illegal to teach languages other than English. In some cases, it was illegal to speak languages other than English. In certain states, speaking in public spaces, say on the train or on the telephone, which apparently is a public space. Robert Meyer, though, doesn't back down. He takes his case up through the courts. And it arrives at the Supreme Court in 1923, And the Supreme Court, in a really fascinating ruling that I would love to get into because we've got a lot of policy folks here in the room, the Supreme Court ruling in 1923, it comes back in favor of Meyer, enshrining the right for the first time in the US for children to learn languages other than English. The next folks I would want to talk about and introduce you to are the Mendez family. 1943, the Mendez family have recently returned to Westminster, California. They've leased a prodigious asparagus farm, and they go to enroll their kids in school. And they're told, you can't enroll your kids in school. This is actually the kid's father's alma mater. This was the school he went to. We can't go here, you have to go a mile away to the segregated Mexican school. Because the time in the 1940s in California and much of the Southwest, there were segregated white and Mexican schools. But the Mendezes don't back down. And so they take the money from their asparagus farm and they organize with other families and they hire a civil rights lawyer from LA and they sue the schools. And their case goes up to the Ninth Circuit, and at the Ninth Circuit in 1947, it comes down in favor of the Mendezes. 2 months later, Governor of California desegregates schools across the state. Now, before I go on to what the governor does, the Ninth Circuit case was supported by amicus briefs from across the country, including an amicus brief from the NAACP, written by Thurgood Marshall, who is watching this case closely. Now, 1947, it comes back in favor of Mendezes. Mendez children go to school. But 6 years later, that governor, he steps down as governor and he assumes a new position. What is it? Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's Earl Warren. And one of the very first cases he hears is Brown v. Board of Education, argued by Thurgood Marshall, who has in his briefcase the notes from the Mendez case. Now, the other stories that weave into this, and again, this is for me, it's about the intimate stories of people, and it was particularly such an honor to learn from many of the folks that were part of these cases, that asparagus farm that they were leasing, why they had just come back to Westminster. They were leasing it from the Munametsu family, who had recently been incarcerated during World War II. And for a time after the case, the Munametsus, after their release, returned to the farm of the Mendez, and the Munametsus lived together on the farm. There's also the story of the lawyer, David Marcus, who is the son of Eastern European Jewish refugees. And for him, this case was personal, both because his daughter, his wife, was a Mexican immigrant, his daughters, they were raising bilingual, but also he too had personally experienced schools telling him he didn't belong. His daughter, who's now in her 80s, was telling me the story of when he was little, he loved to play the violin, loved music his whole life. And at a concert, he was playing violin, but because he was Jewish, he was told he had to play behind a curtain. And another student stood in front of the curtain, miming the music. And these are the stories of individual courageous people. And the last story that I wanted to share just briefly, I'm thinking, okay, well, I will do a short reading of this next story. I don't really want to get into some discussion. The next story starts here. The sun had yet to surface when Lydia and Jose Lopez gently shook their 5 children from their slumber, dressed them in their Sunday best, and tucked the family into their white Dodge Monaco. The sedan was piled high with books, clothes, pots, even the family's small TV. But the Lopezes were not embarking on a road trip. Their destination was a mere 2 blocks away at the Federal District Courthouse in Tyler, Texas. Alfredo, 9, and the oldest, remembers little. It was Friday, the week after the start of school, the year 1977. The little black-haired boy should have been entering 2nd grade. His sisters should have been starting first. But just as classes were set to resume, their parents received a letter informing them that tuition was required if they wished their children to study in the public schools. For the Lopez family, the fee was unaffordable. Just over 2 years earlier, more than 200 miles south of Austin, the legislature had revised the state's education code. But before the final vote was cast, the border city of Brownsville slipped in a provision that, at the time, went largely unnoticed. Going forward, public schools would no longer be obligated to educate the community's undocumented children. And the state would contribute no funds to support these children's academic futures. Public schools were left with a choice: cover the cost themselves, charge tuition, or exclude such students altogether. In the blistering summer heat of 1977, the Tyler School Board, arguing that the city was on the precipice of becoming, quote, a haven for undocumented families, voted to charge tuition for every student who could not prove legal residence. $1,000 per child, roughly 1/4 of most undocumented Texans' annual income. The city of Tyler in the eastern corner of Texas was founded in the mid-1800s, built by enslaved Black Americans, and named for a U.S. president who initiated the annexation of the Lone Star State. Surrounded by vibrant blooms, it was a city that proudly proclaimed itself the Rose Capital of America. And it was here in 1969 where Jose Lopez found work tending rosebuds after crossing the southern border. Within a few years, he sent for his wife and then for his children, who left their home in the small Mexican city of Jalpa and traveled hundreds of miles north to reunite. On arriving in the United States, Alfredo was enrolled in elementary school and attended dutifully until, in the summer of 1977, the school board changed its policy. Of the city's nearly 16,000 students, less than 60 were undocumented, and they were suddenly ineligible to study in the city's schools. Growing up in Mexico, neither Jose nor Lydia Lopez had been able to stay long in school. Their families needed them in the fields. But for their children, they wished for a different future. And so, a week later, a little before 6 a.m., the Lopez family pulled into the parking lot of the Federal District Courthouse, the sky just beginning to bloom pink. There they met 3 other undocumented families. Together, they had made the perilous choice to sue the city schools. It was the decision the parents made knowing what might happen. That was why, the night before, Lydia and Jose Lopez had packed the Dodge Monaco to the brim. As Lydia would recall years later, in walking into the courthouse, they were prepared to be immediately arrested and deported. But for their children, it was a risk they chose to take. And that, and the courage of those 4 families, leads to what we know of today as Tyler v. Doe, the Supreme Court case in 1982, which enshrines the right for undocumented students to have access to the public educational system. And is, of course, also then leads to the DREAM Act, which then fails after 15 years of attempting to get passed. And then DACA, which is announced by President Barack Obama on the 30th anniversary of the decision in Tyler v. Doe. So these are just a few of the stories, and they are powerful and exciting. And speaking to a room of people who are like deeply involved and invested in exploring policies, the laws, the cases, how they weave up is really powerful and cool. But it's also the stories of people and the stories of those individuals. But it's not just the policies of the U.S. that are important when thinking about our students today. It's also about thinking about the policies in other countries and the transnational policies. And I know that, Sarah, when I was in your class, I first became aware of and thinking about how those policies impact kids. And I know I think about that every day when I'm thinking about my students and their lived experience before coming to the U.S. and also the ways in which policies are impacting them still even when they're here. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those policies and the impact on individuals.
Sure. One of the things that I've just been thinking about a lot as you've been talking today, Jessica, is just the way that when people move to a new place and begin to see a new space, begin to build new relationships, how that experience can often lead to these innovations and ideas of how how things might be different. And whether that is a family moving from one place to another and saying, why is this the way it is? This is not the way I thought things should be, and then engaging in these kind of courageous acts. And I think this is one of the reasons for me why the study comparatively across place and time, it doesn't have to be across national borders, but it can be so powerful. And I was thinking about an example transnationally that I think has relevance as we think about experiences in the US. And as I was reading your book, one of the protagonists in your book, Robert, lived in Democratic Republic of Congo and then moved to a refugee camp in Uganda, Chakatu refugee settlement, which is one of the first places that I worked in Uganda. And the protagonist who opens my book, Jacques, I remember sitting in Chakatu refugee settlement with him in southwest Uganda, and him describing the situation of arriving in Uganda as a refugee. He had been a teacher in Democratic Republic of Congo. And the way that schooling was set up in Congo, given ongoing conflict, given very rural areas, he had always been taught that if he arrived anywhere and there were children who didn't have access to school, then it was up to him to create that access to school. But he arrived in Uganda, he came to the capital city, Kampala, and it was against the law for refugees to have access to education. And yet he had this different experience, which was that no matter where you go, no matter what is going on, you should be the one to provide, he should be the one to provide access to school. And so he went about setting up a school and creating the possibility for refugees in Uganda to have access to education. And I think we see these courageous acts in so many different parts of the world. But I also think those experiences then really influence the way that young people, as they come to this country, may interact with policy and may interact with people. And those can be full of assumptions and misunderstandings, or full of these kind of openings to opportunity. And a few of the examples that I was thinking of, I think that when we arrive in classrooms and create community together with our newcomer students, often standing between and amid those relationships are many years of history in which those young people have been told that they can never belong to a particular place, that borders have been closed, that people have arrived at a border and been sent back, been told they can't move any further, have applied for asylum and have had years and years in the waiting, wanting to get to this moment where someone will say, okay, yes, you can come, and feeling like they're constantly seeking permission to create the new life in a new place. And I think that often those of us who have had a far easier time crossing borders, navigating new spaces, deciding to end up in a new place, are not thinking as much about the impact of that kind of past experience on what it might mean to try to create belonging in a new place. And I think this is particularly true in terms of the length of belonging. So many of the students who you write about in your book have been in situations where they didn't know if they were going to be in that school for a day, for a month, for 5 years, or when they might have to suddenly shift. And so to create this sense of every day coming to the same classroom to have lunch was not something that could even be on their radar. And so these kinds of transnational experiences that students bring become so important for us as educators, I think, to understand where students might be coming from, and then also to see these unique opportunities. And one of the things that is core to your book is looking at these new opportunities, these innovations in ways of thinking. And I know that one of them really speaks to this kind of tension that we often find in education, and particularly in immigrant education throughout history, is should immigrant students learn together in community with longtime residents and people with many languages and many cultures and many experiences here in the U.S.? Or are separate spaces important for that kind of education? And you talk about a few examples in your book that are somewhat contradictory in that way. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of these kind of no right answer dilemmas and how to really see them with students.
I was just thinking as you were talking about just some of my students, and again, just thinking about the ways in which I've been so informed by your thinking and how that informs that So just reflecting on that. It's like being back in the classroom with Sarah, so that's really fun. Watch out, I might be back. This is something Sarah and I were talking about, that there are no one answer, there's no one solution. I'm not saying in any of these practices, and none of the teachers that I talk to who are in these schools would say, yes, this is the way you should do it, it's the only way you should do it. It's really about thinking about the specific communities and what that community needs. And so one of the schools that I visited, and then actually I shared with Sarah this chapter in the process of writing to get her thoughts and feedback on it, and her expertise and wisdoms, was a school is a school in Georgia called the Global Village Project. And this is the only school in the United States for refugee girls who spent a long time out of school. If you are a refugee girl and you have perhaps never had an opportunity for formal academic schooling, you show up in the US, you're 16 years old, perhaps you have very little English, you are going to be typically, most states, most communities in the US, put in 10th or 11th grade. Good luck. That's not a winning strategy. That is, and so how to best support students who've had very little access to formal academic schooling? What the school has done has this separate space. It's created a community of about 50 young women who have this lived experience, and recognizes that these young people, they might be 16, 17, 18, but they might need to start at a kindergarten level education. At the same time, they are 16, 17, 18-year-old young women who have shouldered the responsibilities of adults likely for many years. And you need to be honoring both of those identities at the same time. And thinking about how you support these students catch up in those lost years of academic schooling. And they do it in so many beautiful, powerful ways in creating this really joyous community. I have never been to a school, it took me a couple of days being there to realize what was really striking me was the amount of laughter in the school, like joyous laughter. I've never heard this much laughter in a school. And you could see a very different scenario. And I mean, we have the stories too of a very different scenario when students who are just like them, who have had very little access to academic schooling, are put into big public schools, and many often end up dropping out. In the sort of the education jargon for folks who are educated in rooms, like students with limited or interrupted education. But here, learning is joyous. That does not mean it's not frustrating and exhausting at times, but it's also joyous. And they have brought in 100+ volunteers from the local community to come work one-on-one with students every single day to help support their learning. And in doing that, they're able to catch a huge catch-up in about 3 years. They have curriculums that are tailored to every single student, meeting them where they are, and ways for them to jump into essentially what we might consider a first grade curriculum to a third grade to a fifth grade curriculum throughout a year as they are gaining knowledge and skills. And so that flexibility in the curriculum, the support of those mentors, particularly also older mentors, folks who are like in their 60s, 70s, 80s, who are a lot less intimidating when you're practicing a new language. It can be really scary to practice a new language in front of your peers. You have to make mistakes when you're learning a new language and learning new skills, but that can be really hard to do in front of your peers, much easier to do with someone who looks like your grandparents, or is the age of your grandparents. And so what this school is doing is, it is a school that is separate just for these young women. But it is allowing them the space to learn and to connect and to build a community and to feel a sense of belonging here, that then when they go off to high school 3 years later, they're much more likely to find. And they have the support of those community members, those volunteers who are acting as mentors to help navigate those spaces for them. So there are just examples like this that it's not that it's going to work in every single community, but it's thinking about tailoring it to each specific community.
There's just one section of the book about this Global Village project that really struck me, and I think speaks to some of the innovations you talked about, and really actually was the word shocked. As you talked about one particular student who was shocked by what she found in this space because it was so different from what she had experienced, which was not meeting her needs. She enrolled, and that she finally found a place where she could belong, as we come back to this idea. And I think that this book is so full of those moments where you are saying, well, if you think that inclusion and integration is the right answer, then we become surprised by these examples of a separate space. But if we start from a point of thinking about what do students need, what are they looking for, what do relationships look like, what does learning look like, what does it mean to create this process of integration and belonging over time, then we can be shocked and surprised by models of schooling that are really promising in
Right.
these ways.
And they're different. There's a newcomer school in Texas, Houston, Texas, Las Americas, where it's a separate space for students for 6 months or a year. And that's a space for students who are getting their footing. It's also very, they have really powerful trauma-sensitive approaches to supporting students who are grappling with all sorts of either trauma in their past, trauma in their journey, family separation or family reunification, and the ways they are helping them get a foothold before they go into their neighborhood schools. And then there are, of course, other scenarios that work too. There's a classroom in Fargo, North Dakota. It's a big high school, and immigrant students, refugee students who are new to the country come in day one into that school, and they have some separate classes with other English learners. But there's one class of thinking about their connection points and just generally being more intentional. Leah Jolkes, the teacher I profiled in this chapter, has created this partnership class for new Dakotans and old Dakotans. And it is a class for folks new to the country and those who have either been here for 5, 6, 7 years or whose families have been here for generations. And they are learning from each other, they're doing storytelling with each other, if like the two of us are partnered, we're sharing each other's stories, and then I'm telling Sarah's story in the I voice, so I'm stepping into her shoes and she's doing the same for me. And so the ways that she is building connections, I think so often I know from my students, there is that sense of othering, even when they are in supposedly integrated spaces. That sense that certain halls of our schools, certain classes are not places where they feel they belong. And so how are schools intentionally thinking about building those connections, but also recognizing that there are different ways of supporting students that look different, whether they're separate schools for a certain amount of time, or programs within schools, or practices within a classroom.
And I think if we come back to these kind of interconnections between policies and programs and people, I think one of the things that you and I think a lot about is the centrality of relationships in all of this, and yet how counterintuitive it can seem to create policies and programs that are about relationships. And yet what you just described is very intentional, like you and you are going to build a relationship together. And that I'm going to create this, as an educator, I'm going to create the structures for that to happen. I'm going to support you to do that. And I'm going to help each of you know that that's actually your job to do that. And that part of being a successful student is building that relationship and each and all get into that process. Which is, I think, we think about it as kind of a small idea, something we do in our lives, but it's a huge opening to creating this new community and really engaging in this process as you described and making Americans. I'm conscious of time, and I know we really want to open it up to discussion and questions for Jessica, so maybe we should do that now.
Yeah, let's do that. That sounds great. And then we'll do a closeout, but we'd love to sort of open it up for discussion. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. During the lunches, did students ever talk about what it means to be American, whatever that is? And did they feel more or less American as they grew from 1 year to another?
It's a great question. I'll just repeat the question so that everyone can hear them. So During lunches or other conversations, are students sharing or talking about what it felt like for them to be American? Does that change over time, if I've got the question correct? Yes, definitely some in the lunch conversations or in classes, particularly though with the 7 students I sat down with. So I sat down with these students for about 20 hours, not in a go, clearly. But we had a lot of discussions about that. And I mean, each of them is the author of their own American identity. And for each it's different. And when or if or not yet they feel that sense of belonging. So I'll give you 3 quick examples. For one of my students, Diane, she grew up stateless in Zambia. As she has never had a country that recognized her. And so thinking about policies in other states, I mean, that chapter opens with thinking about senses of belonging and policies. The Common App, I'm hoping it will change if it hasn't yet. She calls me over, we're working on her Common App application, and it says, what country are you a citizen from? And there is no possible option for stateless. The Common App cannot conceive of her existence. So we lied. We said, okay, she's a Zambian citizen, because there was no way to answer the question. When she was a high school student, received her green card. It was the first time she had ever been recognized by a country. For her, though, when I was writing the book, she had not yet received her citizenship. And so for her to become American was to get citizenship. She received it last winter. So for her, it's about documentation, because she has grown up not being recognized, not having documentation from any country. For other students, it is maybe not as clear and sort of clear cut as that. So Carla is one of my students from the Dominican Republic. And for her, because the DR is so close, she goes back and forth often during the summer to visit family and friends. And so her identity has been shifting as, is she American, is she Dominican? When she comes here, many people don't see her yet as American, but when now she goes back to the DR, many of her family and friends don't really see her as Dominican either. And so that's a shifting set of identities and not totally sure of where she belongs, and also having all of these identities put upon her by others. Who are you? And the assumptions people are making about who you are. For Sophia, my student who is an Iraqi refugee, her family had to flee Iraq after her brother worked for the U.S. military and her family was targeted by suicide bombs. Her family moved first to Turkey and then to the U.S. And I mean, think about the impact of domestic, international, transnational policies. Her family, two brothers are here. One brother is now in Germany. Two sisters were in Turkey. They had not yet gotten refugee status in the U.S. One gave up and returned to Iraq. And one is still waiting, 7 years, 8 years later. We are hoping that if, fingers crossed, knock on wood, then the next couple months the U.S. will let her in. But she's been waiting in Turkey in limbo, her family not being able to work, her children not really going to school, waiting for the U.S. to let her in. And so this is a family big, beautiful, extensive family that is now split up across the country, across the world. Her brother who lives in Germany has 3 kids, I think almost 4 now, born in like 3 weeks. One was born in Iraq, one was born in Turkey, one was born in Germany. So for her, home is family. And she has both a global family now, but also a family here. And so she has that sense that she's created community, created family, feels that she is American, but also, of course, all of these other things because her family is not yet included. So it's complicated, is the answer to that question. It's different for each student. Wow.
I'm sorry that I have, is this on?
I can repeat your question too.
Okay, yep.
I can project.
You can project.
I might be one of the only people who, in the room who has actually had the privilege of observing Jessica teach. And I watched her when she was working on her early projects. And I'm mentioning this because as a former teacher of almost 30 years here in Cambridge, Ringe and Latin, one of the reasons that I left when I did was I could see the impact of the statewide testing that was starting to have a tremendous impact. And we educators, many people, speak very highly about the importance of social and emotional development of our students. However, in the context of the testing environment, there is zero time for this to happen. And what I saw in Jessica's classroom was a complete and utter commitment to the social and emotional development of her students. And it was quite extraordinary. And for 20 years, I was the photographer and took the headshots of the Cedar portraits at the Boston Arts Academy. And when I came to Jessica's classroom to photograph her students for her books, she asked me to do something that no one else had ever done. For 20 years, I was the one who was helping these seniors design their pictures, but it was really a kind of collaboration. In Jessica's classroom, she said to me, each one of these people has their own story, and therefore, I want them to determine how they want to be pictured based on their story. And it was a huge learning experience for me. So I'm sorry that I have to leave, but this has been just wonderful. Thank you, Jessica.
I know we are at time, so for those of you who do have to go, please feel free to do that. Are you able to stick around for a little bit? I think just following up on what you just said, Phyllis, I'll say one thing in closing and then give you back the microphone. But this idea that really runs through this book, and you've just described, Phyllis, runs through, I think, your classroom, Jessica, is this real question of what can we learn from our students? And how do we go about being the best possible listeners, which often means asking a good question and then keeping quiet. And that is really beautiful. So I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I'm happy to stick around if you want to have one-on-one conversations. I know that when Sarah and I were talking about preparing for this, thinking about the importance of listening to our young people, and as you said, like asking and then like shushing and listening, and then taking that, and I think centering the students' voices, students' wisdom, whether it be in the classroom, whether it be in crafting policies in the US or crafting policies that span countries. How do we create more spaces for listening? And so we, of course, have action items because we were going to have more discussion, but we'll continue this discussion here in a more informal way. But we wanted to ask all of you to think about the ways that you are learning from young people. And thinking too about who our partners can be on this work. Thinking about not just the folks in the room and the folks in either your school or in the organization you're working in, but folks in the community, all the strengths that they bring, particularly bringing in young people. But how do we center young people's voices? How are you seeking out their wisdoms? And then hoping too that you'll engage and you'll collaborate with me, with Sarah, thinking about how we reimagine immigrant education here in the US, how we reimagine refugee education, getting involved in REACH, taking Sarah's classes, reading her book. But that this work can only be done with all of us, and there's a role for everyone in this work. I want to thank you all for coming here. It's really, as I said at the top of the conversation, it's such an honor, and it's really just a joy to be back in this space, to be seeing those purple couches. They hold a special space in my heart. Gutman can't take away the purple couches ever. But really, the year I had at HGSE was transformative for me. And it was in the connections with my peers, the 3 a.m. piles of nachos and discussions about ed policy and continuing those conversations from class. And all I learned from my professors has just so deeply transformed the work I do. So I am so grateful to Sarah for being my teacher, and I'm so grateful for all of my professors in the space, and to just be back here. It's good to be back. Thank you all.
Thank you for being here and for being this model of how you keep relationships and connections over time that continue to grow in such beautiful ways. So we'll be around. Jessica's book is for sale over there if you're interested in getting a copy. And thank you to everybody for being here today.
Thank you.